usually my topics are really covering more sort of the high-level discussions around cybersecurity. It's not really product-related or anything related to that. I've been in this industry for a very long time, and I've also been able to work with some very interesting people on some very interesting projects. And over time, what I've learned to understand is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is that generally across the board, we're really struggling with cybersecurity and all the things that are going on there. There's lots of organizations being taken down by ransomware and other kind of debilitating malware. So what I try to do is to sort of use the presentations that I do in more sort of a documentary style format. It's really not talking about technology specifically, but really around the challenges that we have in cybersecurity, and also provide some examples of things that are done out there by these cyber criminals and nation states to compromise your networks, despite your best efforts to put in the types of controls that you need to in order to avoid those types of things. One of the things I've added in here is, so as a takeaway, really, there's a couple of things that I really stress, and I've learned this over time, is really the idea of building a strategic cybersecurity plan, because it really, at the end of the day, doesn't really matter a lot in terms of what technologies you buy. It's really the use of those technologies and how you strategize the use of those technologies as well. I've worked in various different capacities in the industry. And so I've had a kind of a bird's eye view, of front row seat for almost 30 years around what happens in this industry. So my name's Ken Muir. I've been around for since 1993, actually, in this business. So as I mentioned before, I've had a front row seat to see how this industry has really evolved. There wasn't really a lot going on back then in terms of activity. There wasn't really a lot written about cybersecurity. It really was sort of the Wild West to try to figure out, what the best solutions were for people based on a very limited set of technologies that we had back then. I was published as a top 100 global thought leader for 2020, only one of two people that were representing Canada. And I also made the who's who list in cybersecurity for 2021 as well. I got my network engineering certifications back in 1995. I learned my hacking skills based in the late 90s. I've worked with, anywhere from $200 projects in a mom and pop shop up to multi-million-dollar, very large, complex implementations for both the US and Canadian governments. And I've also built and rebuilt security operations centers. So I know how all this stuff really works from an inside-out perspective. I've done packet level analysis to find the bad guys on the wire. I've built global communications systems as well, using what we call SD-WAN nowadays. Wasn't so cool in terms of the way we were doing this before, but in terms of the way what it was called. But one of the things that I'd learned, my first security operations center that I built was back in 2002. Of course, the very first customer that we had was a $4 billion retailer that was the largest importer of wines and spirits in the world. And they had 800 locations. So if you think about the fact that people are struggling to even secure one location or even a small handful of locations, the idea of trying to secure an organization that's a $4 billion business with 800 locations was a real challenge, with a very limited set of tools that we had back then. Becoming a global thought leader is not about knowing who has the best firewalls in the market or who has the best endpoint security or any of that stuff. It's really a combination of things that you learn over time, and interests that might converge to give you more of a global view of the way things are. I've been very lucky in my career. I've met a lot of very interesting people. I've done a lot of very interesting projects. Peers that I have become friends of mine, or people in a very high level in different countries. And so I've learned from them in terms of what they do to try to help out in reducing the effect that cybersecurity and the implications of that have in the world. One of the areas that most interested me was the history of warfare. I'm a big reader of things that have happened over the last few thousand years. Has really helped to shape my understanding of the way we're supposed to be dealing with what we're calling the cyber war right now. I usually like to start off with, my many influences, and there are two major influences I had in my career. I read the book of Sun Tzu, The Art of War, back in the mid-90s, And it really helped to shape my understanding of the way you're supposed to deal with the threats, because it's really about challenges. It's not strictly about warfare. This book is actually used across a lot of different industries. I found out that there's a lot of different sports managers actually use this book to develop strategy around how they're going to compete in the sports arena. And it's used across the industry. I also learned years later that it was actually recommended reading at a lot of the colleges and universities. And then there was Kevin Mitnick, if you've never heard of him. He's also known as the world's famous hacker. He plied his trade in the late 80s and early 90s before he was picked up by the FBI and then served several years in prison. Now, prior to that, reading his book, I thought that the hack was a technical, purely technical endeavor. What I learned from reading that book was he actually perfected the art of social engineering to be able to make people do things that they weren't supposed to. So obviously that rings true for today. We're still experiencing that type of thing. Social engineering is one way to circumvent security. It doesn't take a lot of technical capabilities, but it's a way of evading firewalls and all kinds of technologies in today's world. But he was using this to be able to walk into buildings and steal their intellectual property. And he did this for many, many years. Like if you read his books, it's astonishing what he was able to do. So there's usually a call to action at the end of these presentations, but I'm just going to bring this right up front. Because I built and rebuilt security operations centers, one of the things that we've aligned ourselves to today is actually following industry standards. How in our entire operation, it's almost military-like, we followed very strictly industry standards. And these standards are globally recognized. They prescribe everything that you're supposed to know, everything that you're supposed to do, and be aware of in terms of what you're supposed to do for cybersecurity. They're really like a guidebook to how to be secure. And so when I say we need to be an expert at what we do, I'm not talking about becoming a cybersecurity expert. What I'm talking about is being an expert at the process around managing security. As an example, like I go into an organization, for instance, that's been hit with ransomware. And in almost every case that I go in now, I found that they haven't patched systems that were vulnerable to, ransomware that are probably 1 or 2 or 3 years old. It's that kind of diligence that really needs to be in place to make sure that the investment that you make in technologies are actually working for you. And building proper security plans around that is really going to help because one of the things I never really hear when I'm talking with customers is they talk about 5-year IT plans, but never really talk about what their plans are for cybersecurity outside of maybe doing a pen test, which is not really the first thing you're supposed to do anyway, and incorporate best practices in order to build out that security strategy. You really need to develop a strategic roadmap. It's so important for the future of protecting our infrastructure. And, every citizen in the country, deserves to have their data protected and their privacy protected. And this is the way you do it. And that's it.